How do you defeat 5 times your enemy? Not by outshooting them, but by making them stop. Imagine a pale dawn over an endless sea of sand. On the horizon, a ragged line of steel, hundreds of tanks, their silhouettes like the teeth of a comb, waits for fuel trucks that never arrive. Closer in, a much smaller force circles, lean and coordinated, roughly 100 tanks and a handful of mobile detachments. According to some post-battle accounts, Erwin Rommel turned that paradox into an operational reality, destroying or rendering inoperative a vastly larger British armored presence, not through head-on attrition, but by attacking what made those machines fight: their supplies, their cohesion, and their ability to move. If that idea grabs you, was this genius or a gamble? Leave a comment below. We'll read the most interesting takes. This is North Africa. The desert is not neutral, it is a consuming element. Distances double, mistakes multiply, and a single broken axle can strand a complex machine hundreds of miles from spare parts. Armies that thrive here are those that think in lines of fuel as much as in lines of battle. Rommel's reputation in this theater rests not just on bold thrusts, but on a ruthless attention to mobility, finding where the enemy is most dependent and turning that dependence into vulnerability. On paper, the British often fielded more tanks. Paper, however, is patient and forgiving. Machines on paper ignore the sun, sand, and distance. They do not factor in the attrition from heat-stressed engines, clogged air filters, worn tracks, or the hours lost waiting for fuel. They also do not reflect the human network: reconnaissance pilots, forward scouts, liaison teams, the dispatch riders who keep the pulse of a formation beating. Rommel's advantage, as a commander, lay in converting tactical mobility and superior local coordination into a strategic lever. If you cannot move, you cannot fight. The core of the story is not a single epic clash, but a chain of cause and effect. It begins with information. Reconnaissance in the desert is the currency of initiative. Aerial scouts and ground patrols are not merely observers, they are selectors. They pick which nodes in the enemy's lifeline are ripe. A fuel column moving through a narrow wadi, a maintenance park where disabled tanks gather, a bridge or ford that funneled vehicles into a single lane. Finding those seams is half the battle. Once identified, those seams can be pried open. Communications and command turn information into action. A commander with radios, clear protocols, and trust in subordinate initiative can mass force at the decisive point faster than a numerically superior opponent can respond. Rommel's approach emphasized decentralized execution under centralized intent, orders that gave unit leaders latitude to exploit fleeting opportunities. Against him, British forces, by some accounts, sometimes suffered from friction: the delay of orders traveling over long distances, the need to coordinate across dispersed columns, and logistical chases that tied up reserves. Where initiative met delay, the smaller, faster German formations could concentrate and strike. But the decisive idea is simple and brutal. Attack the power behind the punch. Tanks are magnificent weapons, but they are not autonomous. They consume vast quantities of fuel and ammunition. Supply columns, maintenance yards, and staging areas are softer than armored formations, and once hit, can paralyze a much larger force. An interdicted convoy does not merely deprive a unit of fuel, it creates a domino. Tanks wait, commanders delay, repair crews are overwhelmed, and morale frays as stretched units inhale the desert dust and their options narrow. Deception and maneuver are the tools that make interdiction efficient. Feints and demonstrations draw attention and reserves. A fast-moving detachment screens one axis, while saboteurs and anti-tank teams prepare an ambush on another. By appearing to threaten a flank, Rommel could lure British columns into predictable funnels, valleys or narrow stretches where road nets converged, then strike the logistical artery flowing through them. Mobility was concentration. In open desert, a smaller force that could choose when and where to fight converted speed into local superiority. Combined arms effects amplified those choices. Anti-tank guns and well-placed infantry teams could make a choke point lethal. Artillery fire on gathering areas turned repair yards into graves of metal. Air reconnaissance and occasional strikes, where available, multiplied visibility and urgency. Engineers could demolish culverts or bridge works, forcing columns into detours that slowed convoys and increased exposure to ambush. Once a column burned, its diesel became an agent of chaos, black smoke, exploding drums, and the shock of an entire supply train severed where it stood. The desert itself intensified the vulnerability. Beyond mechanical breakdowns, simple geometry matters. A single bridge or causeway concentrates movement. A ridge hides a saboteur. A dry riverbed funnels a convoy into a linear trap. Sand magnifies delay. A long detour costs fuel the convoy cannot spare. A stranded tank sits exposed in a landscape that forgives no lethargy. Engines overheat. Crews, exhausted by the heat, make mistakes. The environment amplifies the tactical effect of hitting logistics. Consider a plausible reconstruction of events, not a literal transcript of a single day, but a logical unfolding that explains how a small, mobile force could translate tactical acumen into strategic collapse. Aerial reconnaissance spots a thickening column of fuel trucks and service vehicles moving along a supply axis toward an armored concentration. A ground scout confirms the concentration and notes a choke point, a narrow causeway where geography forces vehicles into a single line. Rommel gives orders to a mobile task force. A portion of his tanks will fix the enemy's attention with a daring demonstration at a different axis, while fast reconnaissance units, light armored cars and motorized infantry, move to the choke. At night, anti-tank teams and engineers slip into position. Early morning artillery harassment pins the convoy in place and creates the illusion of a larger assault. Then the strike hits. Planted charges bring down a culvert. Lethal arcs of fire from concealed guns cut the column in two. Fuel trucks rupture and ignite. Within minutes, the supply train becomes a gauntlet of fire. Vehicles at the center and rear, unable to move past the burning wreckage and waiting for orders they cannot obtain quickly enough, pile up. Men jump from cockpits and flee as the heat renders their radios unreliable and smoke chokes the commanders trying to coordinate a withdrawal. With the supply line severed and the enemy's armored formation immobilized, some tanks out of fuel, others jammed or awaiting repair, Rommel's armor, still mobile and with fuel to spare, can commit localized efforts. A fast-moving squadron appears on the flank and exploits the confusion. Anti-tank crews destroy immobilized vehicles, engineering detachments block escape routes, and where possible, capture intact tanks for intelligence and materiel. A force that could not defeat the larger formation in open combat now controls the fight because the enemy cannot maneuver as a coherent whole. Over the course of a few days, by cutting supply, forcing abandonment, and finishing disabled machines, hundreds of tanks become combat ineffective. According to some post-battle reports and later reconstructions, the numbers are staggering, the destruction or abandonment of many hundreds of armored vehicles. Historians caution that precise figures are difficult to confirm. What is important is the mechanism. Systemic supply interdiction collapsing operational capability. This was not merely an opportunistic raid, it was systemic exploitation. The structural weakness was not the tanks themselves, but the logistical tail that granted them life. Once that tail was broken, the army did not lose its fighting spirit overnight, but it lost its capacity to project synchronized armored force at scale. That is the paradox Rommel exploited. A force that looks dominant on the map becomes fragile when deprived of motion. There are several technical reasons why this approach yields such outsized results. First, mechanical attrition in desert conditions is high. Tanks require constant maintenance. Tracks snap on hidden obstacles. Engines suffer from clogged radiators. Lubricants thin under extreme heat. The spare part network must be continuous. Second, fuel consumption in armored warfare is enormous. A single armored column consumes tons of diesel daily. Interrupt the supply and a battalion becomes a museum of inert vehicles. Third, concentrated supply movement is difficult to conceal. Fuel convoys are loud and visible from the air, and once identified, they present high-value targets that can be struck with relatively light forces. Fourth, command friction compounds the physical problems. When supply is cut, communications overload as commanders attempt to reallocate resources. Delays cascade. Units act piecemeal. The climax of such a campaign is not a cinematic meeting of armor, but a strategic paralysis. Imagine commanders poring over maps as fuel gauges flash zero. Units halt to protect supply points. reserves that could have counterattacked are held back to cover retreats. The numerical superiority that seemed decisive is rendered impotent by arrested movement. Rommel's mobile elements, by contrast, maintain the initiative, sowing confusion and choosing fights of local superiority. The immediate operational payoff is clear: territory, captured equipment, prisoner flows, and, perhaps most importantly, time. A successful interdiction buys space and momentum, allowing a force to reset front lines or to force the enemy into untenable operational choices. But it is rarely a permanent strategic revolution. Enemy commands learn. They reorganize convoys, disperse supply loads, develop better escort tactics, improve communications, and harden choke points. Innovation has a half-life on the battlefield. Today's advantage becomes tomorrow's lesson plan. There is an important human dimension that both explains and tempers these tactical successes. The crews in stranded tanks are not numbers. They are exhausted soldiers, mechanics, drivers, officers making decisions under stress. Their abandonment of vehicles is rarely a simple act of cowardice. Often it is a rational choice when a machine is ablaze, when ammunition cooks off, or when the chain of command has fractured. Rommel's tactics put men, and the harried, desperate logistics teams, at the center of the collapse. The moral distance of the historian must acknowledge both the ingenuity of the commander and the suffering inflicted by his methods. We must also be careful with the narrative of the 100 versus 500 as an exact ledger. Wartime reports tend to magnify or compress realities. An operational unit's paper strength seldom equals the number ready to fight at any given hour. Mechanical loss, manpower shortages, detachments assigned to other duties, and even orientation errors on the ground all reduce effective strength. Many accounts that claim spectacular ratios are reconstructions made after the fact, often by participants eager to explain success or by reporters framing a dramatic storyline. So when sources say Rommel's force of roughly 100 tanks neutralized or destroyed 500 British tanks, treat the claim as a dramatic shorthand for a systemic collapse driven by interdiction and exploitation rather than as a precise accounting. What did the British response look like? Where the enemy hits logistics, the correct counter is to harden those logistics, spread supply loads across multiple routes, improve convoy escorts, move maintenance closer to the front with mobile workshops, and tighten communications so units can react collectively rather than waiting for delayed orders. By some accounts, British commands adapted, improving convoy defense and improving liaison between corps-level and unit-level commands. The learning cycle is swift when the price of a mistake is immediate and visible. For a while, Rommel's methods yielded brilliant dividends. Then the enemy adapted, and the tactical margin narrowed. Strategically, the episode highlights a timeless lesson for armored warfare. Mobility and sustainment are the sinews of power. A mobile force that sees, moves, and sustains itself reliably will be more effective than a mass that cannot coordinate or feed itself. Numbers matter, of course they do, but their value is mediated by supply, maintenance, communications, and the commander's ability to fuse information and act decisively on it. In some environments, particularly harsh ones like the desert, those non-kinetic elements become force multipliers that outweigh raw numerical superiority. There are additional subtleties worth noting. Deception and psychological effects matter. The smoke and chaos of a burning convoy not only destroys materiel, it induces fear and paralysis. When crews see columns burning and recovery stalled, the willingness to press forward diminishes. Moreover, the public and political fallout of a mass abandonment of vehicles can be outsized, affecting morale beyond the theater. And yet, all of this must be contextualized. A battlefield victory that relies on surprise and exploitation is often fragile. As soon as the opponent patches vulnerabilities, escorting convoys with anti-tank assets, hardening choke points, improving repair discipline, the asymmetric advantage shrinks. So what do we learn when we put the image of 100 tanks facing 500 into an operational frame? First, that war is integrative. Logistics and intelligence shape tactical possibilities every bit as much as firepower. Second, that small, well-led, and agile forces can convert strategic insight into disproportionate results by attacking causal nodes rather than confronting visible strength. Third, that environmental factors, heat, distance, and terrain, creates structural dependencies that can be exploited. Finally, that victory breeds correction. The tactics that create stunning results in one campaign become the textbook for the next. It is tempting to frame Rommel as an invincible genius who turned the desert into a stage for dramatic triumphs. The more sober view is that he was an opportunistic and adaptive commander who understood where his enemy's machine was weakest and exploited that weakness with speed and coordination. His successes were real and instructive, but they were not everlasting. For every ingenious tactic, there is a countermeasure waiting in the wings. Consider the image again. Dawn. The sand is stained with diesel. Tanks, once a promise of thunder and maneuver, sit like statues. A small unit threads past, not because it is stronger in raw firepower, but because it is still moving. That mobility is not merely mechanical. It is informational, organizational, and moral. It is the ability to see, decide, and act faster than your opponent while denying him the means to do the same. If this unpacking of one of the war's most striking episodes interested you, subscribe for more deep dives into overlooked turning points and tactical puzzles from Ouattatandreuse. Share the video if it surprised you, and tell us in the comments. Was Rommel's method brilliant exploitation, reckless gambit, or something in between?